Teenage friends vanished on a hike in Colorado. 6 years later, their skeletons is found in a narrow crevice. On an August morning in 2011, two inseparable best friends, both 19, set off into the San Juan Mountains for what was supposed to be a 3-day hiking trip. It wasn't their first time in the backcountry. They'd been on these trails before, knew the switchbacks, the creeks, the way the air thinned as the tree line gave way to granite and sky. They had grown up here, learned how to pitch a tent before they could drive, and carried the quiet confidence of people who understood the wilderness. The only thing different this time was the route, longer, steeper, and far from the places where weekend hikers wandered. If you're finding this story as haunting as we did, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more people discover these hidden stories. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next mystery we uncover. Also, tell us in the comments, what country are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? We love seeing how far these stories travel. Their families had hesitated when they mentioned the plan. It wasn't fear of the outdoors, it was fear of the remoteness. But the girls had prepared carefully. They packed their blue backpacks with food, sleeping bags, water filters, first aid kits, even a satellite messenger their parents insisted on. That device, the size of a paperback, could send an SOS from anywhere. It was their safety net, the one reassurance their families clung to as they waved them off from the trailhead. The first 2 days went as expected. The messenger's location updates pinged from the same stretch of trail they'd mapped out. A quick check-in text came through Monday afternoon. Made it to camp, weather's great. And then, nothing. On Wednesday night, when they were supposed to be back in town, there was still no call. By Thursday morning, their parents were on the phone with each other, voices tight, eyes fixed on the clock. Both girls' cell phones went straight to voicemail. Not unusual for the high country, but they should have been out of the mountains by now. The satellite tracker's account showed the last signal from late Monday night, a small clearing by a creek 10 miles from the nearest road. No movement since. No SOS. That stillness was worse than a distress signal. It meant they had either chosen not to use it, or they couldn't. By noon, search and rescue teams were on the move. Helicopters combed the valleys. Ground crews hiked in with dogs. The weather was holding, but everyone knew it wouldn't last. The trail into the coordinates was grueling. Steep inclines, loose rock, dense spruce closing in on both sides. When they reached the site Thursday afternoon, what they found made no sense. The tent was up, zipped shut. Backpacks leaned neatly against a log. Sleeping bags rolled tight. Food in bare canisters, water filters, headlamps, jackets, all there. Even the satellite messenger sat on a flat rock by the cold fire pit, blinking its steady green light. Nothing disturbed, nothing broken, no sign of a struggle. It looked like they'd stepped away for a moment and never returned. That image, the untouched camp deep in the woods, froze the investigation. It violated every instinct, every survival rule these girls had lived by. Why would they leave without gear, without the tracker? The search widened in every direction from that point. Crews swept the ridges above camp. Divers searched the creek. No footprints, no scraps of clothing, no trail. Just the camp, waiting for them to come back. Days bled into weeks. Leads fizzled. A sighting in a small town turned out to be two strangers. Snow came early that year, burying the search area. By winter, the case was officially cold. Over the next 6 years, it turned into a cautionary story locals told newcomers. Two friends who walked into the mountains and vanished like mist. Then, in late September 2017, a hunter bushwhacking far from any trail heard something strange, the faint rattle of stone on stone. His dog was pawing at a narrow crack between two boulders, whining as if it had cornered something alive. But there was nothing moving in that darkness. He knelt, peered inside, and saw what the shifting light revealed, the curve of a bone, pale against the black rock. Human, worn smooth by time, and lodged deep in the chest cavity, just visible through the gap, was something metallic, rusted and cruelly shaped, catching the last rays of the sun before the shadows swallowed it again. He froze, Breath held, the air suddenly colder inside that shadowed crevice. The crack between the boulders was barely wide enough for a man's arm, but the sight of that bone, unmistakably human, pushed everything else from his mind. His dog kept pacing, whining low, circling back to sniff at the gap. He pulled out a small flashlight from his pack, clicked it on, and angled the beam into the darkness. The light slid across stone, catching dust motes in the air, then fixed on the shape he'd already seen. A rib cage, collapsed inward on itself, lay tilted sideways, wedged tight between the rock walls. Below it, loose bones, a femur, fragments of a pelvis, jumbled together as if they'd fallen there long ago. And in the center, where the spine should have run clean, the metal glinted again. The hunter leaned closer. It was lodged in one of the vertebrae. A point, triangular, barbed on each side. The rust made it jagged, the color of dried blood. He pulled back, heart thudding. This wasn't a lost hiker slipping into a crevice by accident. Something had been driven into that bone, something meant to kill. And this place, hidden, narrow, invisible from the trail, wasn't where you'd expect to find someone who'd simply fallen. His name was Aaron Buckley, a 48-year-old local who'd hunted these mountains for decades. He knew every trail, every game path, every shortcut through the brush. But this crevice? He'd never noticed it. That fact unsettled him almost as much as what lay inside. It meant that whoever ended up here, or whoever put them here, had gone out of their way to find a place no one would stumble across. Aaron glanced at the sky. The light was fading fast. He had no cell signal, not out here. The nearest spot with reception was at least an hour's hike uphill, and with the terrain this rugged, it would be closer to 2. He wasn't about to leave the scene unmarked. He pulled a strip of bright orange surveyor's tape from his pack and tied it to a branch near the rocks. Then he crouched again, taking several photos with his phone, one wide, one closer on the ribcage, and a final one zoomed tight on the barbed metal. He didn't linger. The mountains were quiet in that way that makes you notice your own heartbeat. Even the dog seemed restless, ears twitching at sounds Aaron couldn't hear. He slung his pack over one shoulder, whistled Duke to his side, and started back toward the ridgeline. It was full dark by the time he reached the overlook, where a faint signal flickered onto his phone. He didn't bother with texts. He dialed the sheriff's direct line, told him exactly what he'd found, and promised to wait at the nearest trailhead. By the time he reached it, a pair of county deputies were already there, lights flashing in the dirt lot. The questions came fast. How far, how hidden, how certain was he that it was human? Aaron showed them the photos. The deputies' faces changed. They radioed in for the on-call investigator and told Aaron to lead them back in the morning. Night travel in that terrain wasn't just dangerous, it risked contaminating whatever scene was waiting in the rocks. The next day, they moved as a team. Aaron in the lead, the deputies behind him, and 2 search and rescue techs carrying evidence kits and climbing gear. The closer they got, the quieter everyone became. The crevice didn't look like much until you were almost on top of it. Just 2 leaning slabs of granite, one lodged against the other as if split by an ancient earthquake. But when the deputies knelt, peered into the gap, and saw the curve of bone themselves, the air changed. They worked methodically, photographs from every angle, measurements. A slow, careful widening of the gap by shifting small stones at the edges. The smell that rose was faint but wrong. Not the fresh scent of decay, but the dry, dusty tang of something long buried and left to the elements. The remains were wedged deep, almost 8 feet down, as if they'd slid there or been dropped from above. Piece by piece they brought them out. The skull came last, caught against a ledge, its jaw still partially hinged. No clothing remained, no gear, nothing that spoke to who this had been, except for one detail lodged beneath the rib cage. A rusted piece of aluminum, bent and sharp-edged, no bigger than a coin. It looked like it had once been part of something larger, maybe stamped with a number, but the corrosion had erased whatever was there. It was bagged and logged, the kind of fragment that might mean nothing, or everything. As the remains were laid out on a tarp, Aaron stepped back. The bones were small, delicate, female. The deputies didn't say it, but he knew they were all thinking the same thing. This could be one of the 2 girls who vanished 6 years ago. Maybe both, if the crevice went deeper than they thought. The scene stretched on into the afternoon. They combed the surrounding area for anything, fabric, plastic, metal, but the ground here had been scoured by years of snow melt and wind. If there had ever been anything else, it was long gone. When they finally started the hike back, the evidence bags heavy in their packs, Aaron glanced over his shoulder at the rocks. The shadows had swallowed the gap again, erasing any trace of what had been there. He knew he'd probably never walk this ridge without thinking about it. And he knew the real question wasn't who had died there. It was why. The bones arrived at the state crime lab in Denver under a chain of custody as tight as any homicide case. The lead forensic anthropologist, Dr. Marlene Varga, had handled remains from wilderness recoveries before, but the photos that came with this shipment told her this one was different. She studied the image of the vertebra with the rusted barbed point lodged between two segments. Even without touching it, she knew the force needed to drive something like that into bone wasn't accidental. The first step was cleaning. The soil, pine needles, and mineral deposits were carefully brushed away, each flake of dirt caught in trays in case something small, a bead, a hair, a fragment of cloth, had been trapped with the remains. Under the bright light, the skeleton's proportions told a story. Female, late teens to early 20s, just under 5.5 feet tall. The bone wear was minimal, the teeth still strong, with only a faint line of dental fillings that would be key for identification. Dr. Varga set aside the rusted metal lodged in the spine. Even through gloves, she could feel the jagged edges of the barbs. It was crude, but functional, the sort of thing you might see in a museum display of prehistoric weapons. Except the corrosion suggested decades, not centuries. Someone had made it to be used, and they'd used it on her. While Varga worked in Denver, investigators back in the San Juan County Sheriff's Office were combing through the old case file. The missing hikers from 2011 were on page 1. 19-year-olds Jessica Warren and Paige Lewis, last seen alive at the trailhead with their parents. The undisturbed campsite, the satellite messenger left behind. The hundreds of hours of search time that ended in nothing. Now, for the first time in 6 years, they had something physical that could speak for them. Dental records came back within a week. The recovered remains belonged to Paige Lewis. That confirmation hit her parents like a blow. For 6 years, they'd lived in that suspended place between hope and grief, imagining every possibility but never letting themselves choose one. Now there was no choice. Paige wasn't coming home. What they didn't have, what they needed, was why. And where was Jessica? Denton had a history, a short stint in prison for aggravated assault in his 20s, a drop charge of attempted kidnapping in his 30s when the victim refused to testify. By 2011, he would have been 52, living mostly off-grid. The sheriff's office pulled his file. He'd been questioned briefly during the original search for Jessica and Paige, but his alibi then was that he'd been hunting near Wolf Creek Pass the entire week. No one had pressed him harder. There hadn't been evidence to. Now, with the arrowheads, the proximity of the burial sites, and his known use of handmade hunting gear, Denton was back on their radar. But Denton was also nowhere to be found. His last known address in town was a trailer on the edge of a junk lot. Empty, dust on the floor, a calendar on the wall still turned to the month of May 2 years ago. The Major Crimes Unit began canvassing every bar, feed store, and backroad gas station in the 3 surrounding counties. It was in a feed store in Pagosa Springs that they caught a break. The owner remembered Denton, tall, ropey build, gray beard, always paid cash, coming in just 2 weeks earlier for traps and a spool of fishing line. She even remembered the truck, an old green Ford with mismatched doors. That truck was found 2 days later, parked under a stand of pines at the end of an unmarked logging road. No one inside. The bed was littered with gear, a rolled canvas tarp, a coil of rope, empty beer cans, but nothing that tied directly to the murders. The cab smelled of stale tobacco and damp wool. Under the seat, taped to the underside, was a folding knife with a dark patina along the blade. Forensics would later confirm it was blood. Still, Denton remained elusive. The mountains were full of places to disappear. Abandoned mines, hunters' lean-tos, ravines so deep the sun never touched the bottom. Every day he was out there was another day for him to slip further beyond their reach. Meanwhile, Dr. Varga's work in the lab uncovered something unexpected. Both Paige and Jessica's remains carried faint traces of the same synthetic fiber, a coarse weave consistent with military surplus blankets from the 1980s. The fibers were lodged in the ribcage of one, tangled in the wrist bones of the other. That meant they'd been wrapped, carried, or stored in something before burial. The evidence began to converge. Denton's history with trapping and hunting, his proximity to the crime scenes, the handmade weapons, the cabin, the fibers. But they still didn't have the moment that put him with the girls in 2011. They needed a witness. It came from a man who didn't realize what he'd seen until years later. He'd been hiking with his teenage son in August 2011 near a ridge trail that skirted the area where the bodies were found. Late one afternoon, they'd passed a man coming the opposite way. Older, carrying a heavy pack that seemed to sag with its weight. The man avoided eye contact, muttered something about bear sign ahead, and kept moving downhill fast. The hiker remembered the pack because it had an odd shape, as if whatever was inside wasn't fitting right. When shown a photo of Denton from 2011, he didn't hesitate. "That's him," he said. The sheriff's office now had enough for a warrant. The search would be dangerous. Denton was likely armed, knew the land, and had already evaded them for weeks. The plan was to send 2 teams, one to sweep the cabin site and nearby trails, another to intercept any movement along the old game paths Denton was known to use. As they staged in the early dawn, the air sharp with frost, the sense among the deputies was that this was their one shot. Either they'd catch him today, or he'd vanish into the wilderness for good. The forest was silent in that way. It gets just before the sun breaks the ridge, cold enough for the breath to hang in the air, every sound carrying further than it should. The deputies moved in pairs, their radios low, boots crunching softly on frost-hardened soil. Team 1 headed for the cabin site, its roof now half collapsed, the rusted chimney leaning like a snapped bone. Team 2 cut downslope, following an old elk trail Denton was known to use, a narrow track that twisted between granite outcrops and into deep pockets of shadow. An hour passed before the first sighting. A deputy in Team 2 spotted movement about 200 yards ahead, a figure slipping between the trees, hunched under a heavy pack. Even at that distance, the gait was distinctive. Long strides, weight balanced like someone who'd carried loads over rough country his whole life. The call went out, and the teams began to close the gap. Denton didn't run at first. He kept moving at the same steady pace, glancing over his shoulder once before veering off the game trail and into thicker timber. When the deputies picked up speed, he broke into a sprint, dodging between trunks with a speed that belied his age. The chase tore through underbrush, across a frozen creek, and up a steep incline where the thin air burned in the lungs. It ended in a narrow draw, a wall of rock blocking Denton's escape. He turned, the folding knife in his hand catching the weak light. His face was gaunt, beard matted, eyes bloodshot but unblinking. There was no attempt to talk, no demand to explain. Just a sudden lunge, fast and direct. The deputies met him with force, driving him to the ground, the knife skittering into the leaves. His wrists were bound, the breath steaming from his mouth in harsh bursts. In the interrogation room 2 days later, Denton spoke little. He sat with his hands flat on the table, staring at the wall. When the photos of the arrowhead, the cabin tin, and the 2 girls were placed in front of him, his jaw tightened. It wasn't until they showed him the fiber analysis, the old military blanket linking both bodies, that his eyes shifted to the detectives. What came out wasn't a confession so much as a series of fragments. He'd seen the girls from a distance while hunting. They were heading uphill from their camp, no packs, no gear, just a small book in one of their hands. He'd followed. He said he called out to them, but his voice had spooked one, and she ran. The other froze. Denton claimed he meant to stop her, but the arrow point had gone in deep, and she dropped. He talked about the weight of carrying her body, about the crevice he'd found that fit her like it was made for her. Jessica had come back looking for her friend. Denton said she came at him, swinging a stick, catching him in the face. He'd hit her once, then again, until she was still. The rest was just getting them out of sight. No apology, no flicker of regret. Prosecutors didn't need more. The physical evidence, the witness identification, the fibers, the weapon. It was enough to charge him with 2 counts of first-degree murder. At trial, the defense painted him as a recluse with a troubled mind, but the jury took less than a day to return a guilty verdict. Denton was sentenced to life without parole. For the families, the verdict closed a chapter, but not the wound. Paige and Jessica were buried within a week of each other, their graves side by side on a hill overlooking the valley they'd once hiked together. The trailhead where they'd begun their final trip became an unofficial memorial. Small stacks of stones, faded photographs in plastic sleeves, a pair of worn hiking boots left beneath a pine. 6 years of unanswered questions had ended, but the image that lingered wasn't the arrest or the trial. It was the stillness of that untouched camp deep in the mountains, 2 packs leaning against a log, the fire pit cold, and the satellite messenger blinking into the emptiness. A place where 2 friends had laughed, made plans, and stepped into the trees, not knowing the last ridge they crossed would be the one no one returned from.